Her name was Dana Mitchell. She was 34, working night shifts as an ER nurse. And the last place anyone expected her to be that night was inside a private country club wedding. She stood near the back of the reception hall, holding a small gift she almost didn't bring, trying not to draw attention. The room was filled with polished voices, expensive suits, and people who looked like they had never worried about a bill in their lives. Dana didn't belong there, and everyone could feel it. Then it happened. Her stepsister stood up in the middle of dinner, lifted her glass, and called her out in front of everyone. Dozens of heads turned at once. "This is my stepsister," she said, smiling just long enough to make it look kind. Then her tone shifted. "She's just a nurse." A few quiet laughs slipped through the table. Not loud, not cruel enough to call out, but enough. Dana didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just stood there, calm, like she had heard it all before. But across the table, someone had stopped smiling. The groom's father slowly put down his fork and stared at her, not casually, not politely, but like he was trying to pull something out of a memory he couldn't ignore. And that was the moment everything began to change. "Before we go any further, tell me what time it is where you are, and what city you're watching from. I really want to see how far this story reaches. And if you've ever been underestimated like this, drop a comment and let me know. Then make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens next." Long before any of that, Dana had already understood her place inside that house. It wasn't something anyone said directly, but it showed up in smaller ways that added up over time. Her mother, Sharon Mitchell, had remarried when Dana was still young, and from that point on, everything in the household began to revolve around her stepsister, Paige Mitchell. Paige was the kind of person who fit easily into every room she entered, always dressed well, always confident, always praised for even the smallest achievements. Dana, on the other hand, learned early that effort didn't guarantee recognition, and silence was often easier than trying to explain herself. At dinner, conversations would shift depending on who was being talked about, and when it came to Paige, there was always excitement, plans, and approval. But when Dana spoke, responses were short, distracted, or quickly redirected. Bruce Mitchell, her stepfather, rarely raised his voice, yet his disapproval was clear in the way he dismissed her opinions or questioned her choices without ever doing the same to Paige. Sharon didn't correct it, not once, and over time, that silence became louder than anything else in the house. There were moments that stayed with Dana more than others, like the time Paige received an expensive gift to celebrate a minor achievement while Dana's own milestone passed without acknowledgement, or the way relatives would visit and immediately ask about Paige's future while barely remembering Dana's name. Even as a teenager, Dana noticed how introductions were handled differently, how Paige was presented with pride, while Dana was mentioned as an afterthought, something added at the end of a sentence. When Dana talked about becoming a nurse, the reactions weren't supportive. They were measured, almost amused, as if she had chosen something small on purpose. Bruce once asked her why she would settle for a job like that, when she could aim higher, and Paige laughed in a way that made it clear she agreed. Dana didn't argue, not because she had nothing to say, but because she already knew how those conversations ended. Over time, she stopped bringing things up altogether, keeping her plans to herself and focusing on what she could control. The house itself never changed, the same rooms, the same routines. But the way she moved through it did, quieter, more careful, avoiding attention whenever possible. It wasn't a single moment that defined how she was treated. It was the repetition, the pattern that made everything predictable, the understanding that no matter what she did, it would never carry the same weight as anything Paige accomplished. By the time she walked out of that house, no one tried to stop her. Donna didn't make a scene, didn't raise her voice, didn't even pack much beyond what she could carry. She just left quietly, closing the door behind her without expecting anyone to follow. There was no argument waiting for her. No last-minute attempt to fix things. Just the same indifference she had lived with for years, stretched into silence as if her absence made no difference at all. She found a small place on her own, something barely affordable, working long hours while taking classes, building a life that depended entirely on her own effort instead of anyone else's approval. The days were exhausting, the nights even more so. But for the first time, everything she achieved belonged to her. No comparisons, no dismissive comments. No one reducing her choices to something small. Over time, she stopped checking her phone for messages that never came, stopped wondering if anyone would reach out. Because they didn't, not once, not even out of curiosity. Holidays passed without invitations, family gatherings happened without her name being mentioned, and the longer it went on, the more it became clear that her absence had been accepted as something permanent rather than temporary. Then, Sharon Mitchell didn't call, Bruce Mitchell didn't ask where she had gone, and Paige Mitchell moved forward with her life, as if nothing had changed, as if Dana had simply faded out of the picture in a way that required no explanation. There were moments when Dana heard about things indirectly, through distant relatives or mutual acquaintances. News that reached her without intention, like hearing that Paige had celebrated milestones, surrounded by people who never once questioned why Dana wasn't there. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet in a way that made it more final. The kind of separation that didn't need to be announced because everyone had already adjusted to it. Dana continued moving forward, finishing her training, stepping into hospital work where decisions mattered and actions carried real weight, where people didn't care about her background, only whether she could do her job. She learned how to stay focused under pressure, how to make choices quickly, how to keep someone stable long enough for help to arrive. Skills that required discipline rather than approval. In that environment, nothing about her was considered less, and that difference reshaped how she saw herself, not as someone overlooked, but as someone capable. Years passed like that, steady and self-contained, until the distance between her and her family stopped feeling temporary and settled into something permanent, something that no longer expected repair. The invitation arrived without explanation. Dana didn't expect it, and for a moment, she thought it had been sent by mistake, the kind of formal envelope that usually went to people who were still part of the family. Not someone who had been absent for years without a single conversation. It carried Sharon Mitchell's name on the return address. Nothing personal, nothing handwritten, just a printed card with details about the ceremony and reception at a private country club. Known for hosting people who valued appearance as much as reputation. Dana held it for a while before deciding what to do, not because she felt welcomed, but because ignoring it would mean leaving something unfinished, and she wasn't sure she wanted that. When she finally arrived that evening, the setting confirmed everything she had expected, the entrance lined with staff who greeted guests by names, Polished floors, reflecting soft lighting, and conversations that sounded practiced rather than spontaneous. Dana chose a simple dress, nothing that stood out. Something that allowed her to move through the space without drawing attention, though it didn't take long to realize that attention would come anyway, just in a different form. People noticed her in the way they glanced twice, not recognizing her immediately, but sensing that she didn't quite fit into the picture they were used to. As she moved toward the reception area, she caught sight of Paige Mitchell across the room, surrounded by guests who leaned in when she spoke, her posture confident, her presence expected. Everything about her lined with the environment she had grown into. There was no fruity pause hesitantly. There was no sign of hesitation in Paige's expression when she noticed Dana. Just a brief pause before continuing her conversation, as if nothing required acknowledgement. Sharon Mitchell stood nearby, greeting guests with controlled warmth, offering smiles that looked practiced rather than genuine, and when her eyes passed over Dana, there was no visible reaction, not surprise, not discomfort, only a brief recognition that didn't turn into an approach. Bruce Mitchell remained close to her size, engaged in conversations about business and connections, his attention never shifting in Dana's direction, as if ignoring her was the simplest way to maintain the order he preferred. Dana found a seat near the edge of the room, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain outside the center of attention, watching how introductions were made, how names were exchanged, how people measured each other in subtle ways that didn't need to be spoken aloud. That was when she noticed Victor Lawson for the first time, standing near the main table, speaking with a group of guests who listened carefully, his tone controlled, his posture composed, someone clearly accustomed to being taken seriously. His attention shifted briefly toward Dana, not long enough to draw notice from others, but enough to suggest that he had already begun assessing where she belonged within the structure of the evening, a silent evaluation that carried more weight than any direct question. Dana looked away before the moment extended, choosing not to engage, not because she couldn't respond, but because she understood that in a room like that, attention was rarely neutral, and being seen often meant being judged before a single word was exchanged. Dinner was halfway through when Paige decided it was time. The conversations around the tables were steady, polite, predictable, the kind of controlled environment where nothing unexpected was supposed to interrupt the flow. But Paige shifted in her seat, lifted her glass, and drew attention without raising her voice, a quiet signal that still managed to carry across the room. People turned toward her naturally, waiting, assuming it would be another charming moment, another carefully presented piece of the evening. She smiled in a way that looked practiced, then let her gaze move through the room until it landed exactly where she wanted it. Dana didn't react at first, not because she didn't notice, but because she understood the pattern, the setup that always came before something unnecessary. "I want everyone to meet someone," Paige said, her tone light, almost playful, as if what followed was harmless. A few guests leaned forward, interested. Others simply paused their conversations, watching without fully committing to the moment. Paige gestured toward Dana with a small movement of her hand, controlled, deliberate, drawing a line of attention that felt impossible to ignore. "This is my stepsister," she continued, leaving just enough space to hold attention before finishing the sentence, a pause that made the room quieter than before. Then she added, "She's just a nurse." The reaction wasn't loud, not enough to be openly offensive, but it was there, a ripple of low laughter, a few exchanged looks, the kind of response that stayed within the limits of politeness while still carrying meaning. Dana stood up, because remaining seated would have made it worse, moving toward the center of attention with the same controlled pace she used in situations that required composure, her expression neutral, her posture steady, giving nothing away that could be used against her. Paige kept her hand lightly against Dana's shoulder for a moment, a gesture that looked friendly from a distance, but carried something else underneath, something closer to ownership than connection. "She's always been very practical," Paige added, her voice still smooth, never really interested in anything beyond hospital shifts. Another small wave of reactions followed, softer this time, more restrained, but still present enough to define the tone of the moment. Dana didn't interrupt, didn't correct anything, didn't offer context, because she understood that responding would only extend the scene in a way Paige would enjoy. Across the table, Eric Lawson shifted slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to show discomfort, his expression tightening for a brief second before returning to something more neutral, something controlled. Victor Lawson didn't react outwardly, but his attention remained fixed, his gaze moving between Paige and Dana with a level of focus that suggested he was processing more than what had been said. Sharon Mitchell lowered her eyes to her plate, not engaging, not intervening, maintaining the same distance she had always chosen in moments that required a decision. Bruce Mitchell remained still, his posture unchanged, his silence consistent with everything Dana had known growing up. The room settled again after a few seconds, conversations slowly resuming, but the shift in atmosphere remained, subtle but clear. Something that didn't disappear just because people chose to move past it. Dana returned to her seat without hesitation, her movements measured, her expression unchanged, as if nothing significant had happened, even though the room had already decided how to categorize her within a single sentence. Across the table, Harold Lawson had already stopped paying attention to the conversation. While others returned to their meals and light exchanges, his focus remained fixed. Not openly enough to interrupt the flow of the evening, but persistent in a way that suggested something had unsettled him. He leaned back slightly, studying Dana, with a level of concentration that didn't match the casual nature of the moment, as if he were searching through something distant, trying to connect details that refused to come together quickly. Eric Lawson noticed the shift first, turning toward his father, with a brief question that didn't carry beyond their side of the table, but Harold gave only a short response, his attention still elsewhere. Victor Lawson followed that gaze, soon after, his expression sharpening as he began to observe the same detail. Not reacting immediately, but clearly registering that something about Dana didn't align with the impression that had just been presented. The room continued around them. Conversations rebuilding, the atmosphere smoothing itself out, but at that table, a quiet tension formed that hadn't been there before. Harold set his fork down with deliberate care, his posture straightening, as if a memory had moved closer, not fully clear, but no longer distant. He spoke again, this time directing his voice slightly outward. "What did you say your name was?" The question was calm, but it carried enough weight to draw attention back toward the center. Dana answered simply, without hesitation, her tone steady, offering no more than what was asked. Harold repeated the name under his breath, testing it, aligning it with something unfinished in his mind. Paige gave a small laugh, dismissing the moment as unnecessary, brushing it aside with a light comment meant to redirect attention. But Harold didn't respond to her tone. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing with focus rather than suspicion. "Where do you work?" he asked next, each question narrowing the distance between uncertainty and recognition. Dana gave the name of the hospital, nothing more, no added detail, no attempt to guide the conversation, allowing him to reach whatever conclusion he was moving toward on his own. Victor shifted in his seat, now fully engaged, watching both sides of the exchange with clear interest. His earlier assessment replaced by something more precise. Harold exhaled, slowly, the kind of breath that came when something finally aligned, not sudden, but certain. "A few years ago," he began, his voice steady but lower than before, "I had an emergency during a private dinner event." The words pulled attention back again, not loudly, but firmly enough that nearby conversations began to fade. He didn't rush, allowing each piece to settle before continuing. There was a delay getting full medical support, longer than it should have been. His gaze returned to Dana, no longer searching, now recognizing. There was one nurse who stayed the entire time. The room grew quieter without anyone asking for silence, the shift happening naturally as the meaning of his words became clear. "You kept me stable," he said, not as a question, but as confirmation, his tone carrying a weight that made it impossible to dismiss. Eric looked between them. Chifation, confusion giving way to understanding. While Victor's posture changed entirely, his attention no longer analytical, but focused on what had just been revealed. Harold turned his head slightly toward Paige, not raising his voice, not needing to, the control in his tone enough to hold the room. "You introduced her as just a nurse," he said, each word measured, leaving no room for interpretation. "That nurse is the reason I was able to sit here tonight." The statement settled heavily across the table, shifting the balance of the entire evening in a way no one had expected. The music resumed, but the atmosphere no longer matched the setting. Conversations returned in fragments, rather than flow, quieter, less certain, as if people were adjusting to a shift they hadn't expected to witness. At the main table, no one moved immediately, the weight of what had just been said lingering in a way that made simple reactions feel inappropriate. Paige Mitchell remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, her expression no longer controlled, the confidence she had carried earlier replaced by something less stable, something that didn't align with the image she had spent the evening maintaining. Eric Lawson looked at her differently now, not with anger, but with a kind of distance that hadn't been there before, as if he were reassessing something he had assumed was already clear. Victor Lawson broke the silence first, his voice measured, not raised, but precise enough to draw attention back, toward the table. He didn't address Dana, he addressed Paige, his words direct, stripped of any attempt to soften their impact. He spoke about judgment, about presentation, about the consequences of choosing to diminish someone in front of people who understood exactly what that work required. And while his tone remained controlled, the message carried more weight than any public reprimand could have. Harold Lawson didn't add to it. He didn't need to. His earlier statement had already defined the situation, and the authority behind it remained present without repetition. Sharon Mitchell attempted to intervene quietly, leaning toward Paige with a suggestion that sounded more like damage control than concern. But the timing was too late. The shift in perception had already settled among the guests. Bruce Mitchell remained silent, though his posture had changed, less certain than before, as if the structure he relied on had been disrupted in a way he couldn't easily correct. Around them, conversations continued. But they were different now, more aware, more selective. The earlier ease, replaced by a subtle distance that affected how Paige was approached, how she was spoken to, how she was viewed within a room that valued perception above all else. Dana stayed seated long enough for the moment to pass without becoming the center of attention again. Then stood, not abruptly, not in reaction, but with the same measured control she had maintained throughout the evening. She didn't look toward Paige, didn't wait for acknowledgement, didn't pause for anyone to speak to her, because nothing that could be said at that point would change what had already been revealed. As she moved toward the exit, a few guests glanced in her direction. Not with curiosity, but with recognition, a shift that didn't require words to be understood. Outside, the air felt different, quieter, removed from the structure she had just stepped away from. And, for the first time that evening, there was no expectations attached to where she stood or how she was perceived. Sharon called after her once, not loudly, just enough to be heard, but Dana didn't stop. Not out of anger, not out of defiance, but because she understood that some distances weren't meant to be reduced once they had been clearly defined. In the days that followed, messages appeared, attempts to reconnect, explanations that arrived too late to carry meaning. But Dana didn't respond, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she no longer required acknowledgement from people who had only recognized her value when it served them. What remained wasn't resentment. It was clarity, the understanding that respect built on convenience was never real to begin with, and that silence, when chosen rather than imposed, could be a form of control rather than absence.